Hey there, yarn crazies. If you enjoyed my Magic Loop How To Basics episodes and still crave more detail, this episode is for you. Welcome to the I Heart Yarn channel. If you are new here, my name is Shauna, and today I'm doing my very first Q&A video. After my success with Magic Loop and 2 at a time on Magic Loop episodes launched, questions started to roll in like, why not use stitch markers instead of running a basting line, and what does picking up along the side of the heel flap look like? So today I'll discuss a few answers and I'll demonstrate a few others. If you haven't seen either of those videos, I am not going to say that this video won't benefit you, but you will probably get a lot more out of it if you go watch one of those first. I also have my first toe-up socks close to completion, and I'll be sharing with you what I have learned about doing socks 2 at a time, toe up versus my normal cuff down. So let's get down to the weeds on Magic Loop. Question number 1 came from one of the other instructors at the shop. She asked about pinning the cast on edges together with locking stitch markers instead of running a basting line. Her question made me laugh a little bit because that exact same idea was the first thing that hit my brain when I was wrangling with the problem of the twisting cast on. I was so excited and hopeful when I tried it, but you know what they say about theory versus practice. The stitch markers worked sort of in that they did keep the cast on from twisting and spiraling, but they were also constantly getting in the way of my fingertips and making it hard to keep a grip on the needles in the project. They made the first several rows terribly awkward, and I couldn't wait to remove those things. I actually tried the basting line as a way to get away from the bulk and discomfort of the stitch markers. Question number 2, why not leave a long tail when casting on and baste with that instead? For cuff down socks, you could baste with the tail, but I personally avoid doing it that way, mostly because removing a basting line that blends in that well could be incredibly annoying. That being said, if you want to try it that way anyway, I suggest doing so only with superwash wools to avoid some of those oh so wonderful little wool on wool snarls, and to make the length of the basting stitches pretty exaggerated so they are easier to see. A long stretch of yarn running perpendicular across the stitches of the fabric will make seeing that line and picking it out just a little bit easier. Stitch back and forth a few extra times with your basting line to make sure you keep those edges stable. Now here's some great news for toe up. You can throw all that straight out the window. The now commonly called for Judy's Magic Cast On means no edges to roll and twist. If you do another cast on that involves a gap to close up one way or another, run a basting line, but leave yourself a long tail with the original yarn that you can use to graft the edges together with Kitchener stitch or 3-needle bind off at the end of the project instead. And because a few people ask, there are links in the show notes to a couple of places where you can buy this, my favorite style of wool needle for basting with. Now, a question about doing ribbed cuffs came up in the comments section of the Success with Magic Loop episode I did. I did not start out with ribbing when I was demonstrating the basic technique, and the viewer wondered if I do ribbed cuffs on my socks. Yes, I definitely do ribbed cuffs for socks because, well, quite frankly, baggy, loose-fitting socks make me irrationally angry. It's just a thing with me, and this is part of why I'm a huge fan of twisted rib for sock cuffs. I like the defined look, and I love the slightly snugger fit. Twisted rib is achieved by knitting and or purling through the back loops of a stitch. If you aren't familiar with how to do that, keep watching. I'm going to show you how that works in the demonstration section later in the video. But I will say here that I prefer to twist just the knit stitches and purl normally. Twisting both knits and purls can leave the fabric just a little too tight for comfort. Question 4 is from a viewer who reported having trouble getting the tips of their needles shoved back into the half of the stitches that had previously been parked on the cable, and she wondered if she might be pulling too hard when snugging down the first stitch of the row. When I was starting out with Magic Loop, I was doing that exact thing, so probably yes. I tend to gauge loose as it is, and I was so desperate to avoid laddering that I was pulling way too hard on that first stitch. The good news is that awareness is most of the battle here, and with a little bit of conscientious practice, you'll find what I call the Goldilocks zone. Not too loose and not too tight, but just right. Now, if you are sure you aren't tugging too hard on your first stitch or accidentally tugging on the last stitch of the previous section after you pull the back needle out, which I was also guilty of for a little while, your needle may be the problem. One of the reasons I am such a huge fan of the ChowGoo needles is the incredibly smooth transitions from tip to cable on both the fixed tips and the interchangeable sets. If your stitches keep hanging up when it's time to reset and work on the other half of your stitches, check that transition point on your needles for rough spots, burrs, cracks, or sadly maybe just poor construction. It is shocking just how tiny a gap or an irregularity between the cables and the tips it can take to cause you a problem. My first demo section today features a piece of the cuff down construction process. A viewer asked if I could demonstrate what it looks like to pick up stitches along the edges of the heel flaps when doing 2 at a time on Magic Loop. So let's take a closer look at that part of the sock knitting process.
Here's our heel flap, and we're going to be picking up stitches along this edge right here. Now you can see that the angle's really tight with this tip, and we're working right in this zone. So my favorite tool for doing this is actually my handy dandy crochet hook here. I like to pick up underneath a couple of strands because I feel like it looks cleaner and it feels stronger. You just pull up a loop, park on the tip, and pull it down tight. You go to the next one in line, draw up a loop, pull it up, park on the tip, pull it down tight. And you just work that way along this edge, loading up loops. If you don't want to use a crochet hook, you can definitely use the needles. Now, unfortunately, the free needle here from the left-hand side is at the completely wrong angle to try and do this with. You can take the right-hand needle and slide it down deeper into the stitches already on the needle till you just have that little tip showing. Now you can use that tiny little tip and pass underneath the strands you want to anchor under, do your wrap, and carry it up and through. Just a little bit, you don't need a huge amount of needle. Anchor, draw up that loop, and there you go. Do one more this way. You have to be very careful to not skewer the strands you're passing under and to not pick up strands as you're bringing it through with that tip of your needle. I'm going to do this American style for you throwers. Carry that through. Go to our next stitch in line, pass that tip under, wrap the yarn, do your yarn over, and bring that loop up and through. So I'm going back to my crochet hook because I find this faster and easier. Pull up that loop, park and pull, drop a loop, park and pull. I find I'm less apt to snag yarn from other loops if I use a crochet hook. It's a little easier on the fingers. You would do the same for these stitches along, making sure you have the edge of each row of the heel flap picked up. And some people like to pick up an extra loop right here in this area in the fabric, and then when you're working through that area you do a knit two together, and it creates a nice tight spot of fabric that closes up a hole that can form right there at that junction between the heel and the rest of the sock.
Now let's get a look at the twisted rib I mentioned earlier so you can decide if you want to try it on your projects.
Let's look at the mechanics and what it takes to get ribbing that looks like this. Here's a section of fabric I started. to demonstrate this for you, I'm going to knit the first stitch normally. Now, to twist a knit stitch, instead of going under the front leg like you normally do, you're going to go under the back leg. Let's go through that again. Take the tip of your needle, go underneath, not the front leg, but the back leg or back loop of the stitch, yarn over, and complete the stitch as you normally would. Back leg, yarn over, pull it off. Fast forwarding through these for you. Okay, let's get a look at these. Look at those. The left leg is really, really twisted. It's at a different angle than the ones beneath. The back doesn't look any different from what you're used to seeing. They might be a little smaller and a little tighter, but visually they're not different. But the front sure is. I'm going to finish the rest of this row knit normally, knit through the front loop, the front leg, so you can see the difference within the same row. There's our twisted knits. Here's normal knits. You really do sit at a different angle. That twist tightens up the fabric. Let's twist our purl stitches now. Knit that edge stitch. Now instead of the front, again, we're reaching around from behind and we're picking up the back loop or back leg, doing our yarn over, our wrap, and pulling that stitch off. Okay, yarn is in front, as it normally would be for purl, but you're going to reach around at the tip of the needle, you're going to come behind that back leg and complete your stitch. It feels a little strange. You also notice that this side doesn't look any different. Back leg, pull it off. Back leg, pull that off. It takes a little bit of getting used to, but after a while you get in a rhythm and you find yourself almost doing this by default. Let's look at the front of our fabric. There's the twisted knit facing side with those more heavily angled legs of the stitches right there. It starts to make the fabric look just a little different. When you're not doing ribbing, the effect is more subtle. I'm going to finish this row for you. Fast forward. Okay, let's look at our fabric now. Especially at this edge, this end, we've got a couple of rows of twisted stitches going on. Now let's put these together. We're going to do some twisted ribbing here. Knit our edge stitch normally. Now we're going to start by twisting. Knit through the back leg, pull it off, yarn to the front, and purl through the back leg. Knit through the back loop of the back leg, pull it off, yarn to the front, reach around from behind, and purl underneath that back leg. Pull that off. Now you can start to see the ribbing forming. Now rather than keep working on this, I made you guys a swatch. Now you can really start to see how different twisting can look when you put it in ribbing. This is normal knit one purl one rib. This section here in the middle, this is twisted knit stitches only, the purls are normal. This top section is what happens when you twist everything, the knits and the purls. Isn't that amazing how different that can look? Regular knits, knits and purls twisted. Let's look at the back of the fabric. On the reverse side of the fabric, the difference can be even more obvious. Here's our normal knit one purl one, twisted knits only, twisted knits and purls in this section. Look at the definition and look at how much it scrunches in. This is the one I normally do for cuffs of my socks and things. This one, it's really pretty and it's high definition, but it can also be a little tight. It does stretch open, but not quite as much as just knits or, of course, as normal. So I recommend you experiment and see which of these you think is going to work best for you and for your project and how you want things to fit. There we go, twisted rib.
Any of you who watched my 2 at a time video may recall my recommendation to avoid fancy color work socks, and I still recommend beginners avoid it. But as someone who absolutely hates restrictions of any sort, I couldn't help it. I immediately began experimenting on a pair of 2 at a times in more than one color. I have tried the Russian join and overlapping ends method and securing the end of each new strand with a stitch marker, leaving an end to weave in later. They all have pros and cons, but I find myself most frequently doing Russian join right now, and here are some visuals on why.
I have marked the place where I want my color to change with a stitch marker, a sharp little stitch marker poked right through the yarn right there. I then tink those back to give myself room to do my Russian join, and there's my color change happening right where that stitch marker was marking the location. I will re-knit these, and that color change will hit right where I need it to. That way when I resume my project, I don't have any ends to weave in, and I just proceed forward with a continuous line of yarn that just seems to have magically changed colors right where I wanted it to. Fast forward knitting. Okay, and there you go. My color changed and I didn't have to mess with any ends. Now if you don't want to do Russian join or you're in a hurry, you can just take the color that you're changing over to. You can take the end and you can use a wool needle and you can weave it through the fabric and let the tail poke out on the right side. I like to secure it with a slip knot around a stitch marker. That way I can just remove that stitch marker later, pop the slip knot, and on the inside of the fabric you can take a wool needle or a finer DPN and you can pick that tail out so it's here on the wrong side of the fabric. At which point you can weave it in now before you proceed with the rest of the project, or you can leave it for later to weave in as part of your finishing up phase of your sock project.
Sorry, I know any number of you right now are watching this and yelling at me through the screen because I didn't show the process of doing the Russian join. I promise I'm going to make it up to you by doing a very detailed how-to video for that technique in my very next episode. So make sure you are subscribed and hit the notifications buttons down below so you can watch that video in a week or two when I put it out. Now, I must mention that if you want to do color work socks 2 at a time, there is a fairly simple way you can do that without multiple balls running around and getting all tangled up. You can use your sock in progress as a pouch for small balls of your extra colors. I have been doing that with these, the little balls of that mousy brown right inside the socks, and I am wrapping the colors around each other at the beginning and end of each row to carry the unused color until I need it again. You obviously can't carry a huge amount of yarn inside the sock in progress, but it does drastically reduce the number of times you have to stop and do any sort of join whatsoever before you can keep going with your project. If you are now a Magic Loop fan like me, you may find yourself wondering, now what the heck do I do with all of these DPNs? People assume I hate double-pointed needles, and I really don't, I promise. I just hate working in the round with them. I actually have quite a few DPNs and I use them fairly often. I use them for swatching for a new project, or I'll add a couple of rubber bands and I'll use them as stitch holders. My favorite knit stuffy patterns generally start out by making an assortment of smaller parts that get added to the body as you go, and I use DPNs to park those pieces until I am ready for them. They make assembly a lot easier. I use double pointed needles when I am teaching to point at specific stitches, and I also use them to count stitches when I am reading the gauge of a swatch. But my absolute favorite way to use DPNs is for these cool little beaded stress balls. I have made lots of these, and a pair of DPNs makes the perfect needle for this pattern. If you have another use for DPNs in your knitting or crochet or weaving projects that I didn't mention here, please let me know in the comments section. I'd love to hear what else you do with your DPNs other than working in the round. If you have questions outside of what I covered here today, please let me know in the comments section or send me an email. If I get enough for another follow-up video, I'll do another one of these. But my next video is definitely going to be the nitty-gritty on Russian join and the wonderful things it can do for your knit and crochet projects. Feel free to follow me on Instagram if you'd like to see what projects I currently have in progress, new yarns or patterns I am crushing on, and whatever other shenanigans I may be up to. Halloween is upon us, the holidays are on the near horizon, and even though time seems to speed up as the end of the year approaches, please don't forget to take time to work on things that make you happy, and I'll see you next time.